maybe one or two people don't know, but my name is Pete Sheridan. I'm the president of the Elgin Historical Society, and this is our first virtual event. We're going to try this out to see how it goes. We've had a moderate turnout, but see how it turns out and what sort of product we get at the end. We're going to talk today about the Ermatinger family. The Ermatinger family, there's a little tiny street off of Churchill Crescent, and it fits with my theory that the more important you are to St. Thomas history, the smaller the street that you'll get. There's only 6 or 7 houses on Ermatinger Street, but it's for a century or more, the Ermatingers played a central role in St. Thomas and Elgin history, and even further into Canadian history. We'll touch a little bit on that. I'm going to center it on 3 main people that I'm going to go through generations: Edward Ermatinger, Charles Oakes Ermatinger, and Charles Percy Ermatinger, generally known as Percy. These 3 men will take us from the arrival of Edward Ermatinger in St. Thomas is 1830 to Percy Ermatinger's death in 1945. But we'll start a little bit further back than that, because we'll need to know about the background of the family, where they came from, and where they came from was Switzerland. Schaffhausen, Switzerland, particularly. I could trace their family back to 1500 there, although there's a village just a few miles from there called Ermatingen, and the name Ermatinger means somebody from this village, Ermatingen. They made their way a few miles by 1500, and for several hundred years they lived in this very quaint, pretty Swiss village up near the German border, and they were generally employed as gunsmiths, particularly naval gunsmiths, which I haven't learned a lot about, but they seem an awful long way from the ocean to be naval gunsmiths, but that was the trade. That was until one of their members, Lawrence Edward Ermatinger II, born in 1736, a merchant, moves to England, becomes partners with a man named Try. Try and Ermatinger is the firm. And soon after that moves to Montreal, soon after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham and the British conquest of New France. Sets up business there. There's a map of the province of Quebec as it was in those days. The province of Quebec actually will grow a few years after that and will encompass this area. This, where we're sitting, was province of Quebec for a while. But back then, it encompasses that. He will have an up and down career in business in Montreal. He will have some troubles during the American Revolution, and the Americans arrest him, and he escapes to the woods and some other adventures. His business partner in England goes bankrupt. That sets him back. His business burns down. But he does make one very important connection. 3 years after his arrival, he marries his business partner's daughter. His business partner's name is Forrest Oakes, and his wife's name is Jemima Oakes. Jemima and Oakes will enter the Ermatinger family. Those 2 names will come up quite a bit, but this will be a significant business connection for him. And what he's really engaged in is the fur trade. He's sending furs back to England, but he's also sending supplies to the various fur trading stations where the fur trappers and the traders are trading for goods out in the West. And this will become a significant family business. This is their first entry into fur trading. As I said, his business will be up and down. Eventually, he will get into debt, have to sell all of his properties, retire from business. But before that happens, he's quite active. He's quite active. And he has 3 sons who will all be of importance to our story. First one, Lawrence Edward Ermatinger III. Unlike his 2 brothers, he will not go into business. He will go into the army, and he will take advantage of his father's or his family connection. Sir Hildebrand Oakes, a relative of his mother's, is the quartermaster for the British Army for the Mediterranean region. And for the next 20 years, Lawrence Ermatinger III will travel across the Mediterranean as the British Army battles Napoleon. And I always wonder about this. Later on, when we get to Edward Ermatinger, we'll see the connection that Edward will have with Thomas Talbot, and his Thomas Talbot is involved in these same conflicts. And I'm wondering if there is always a connection or storytelling about that. His other uncle, or sorry, uncle of Edward, or the son of our first Lawrence, is Frederick Ermatinger. He will become sheriff of Montreal, and the Ermatingers will become a very substantial family in Montreal. Several sheriffs and just leading business and political leaders. I should warn you first, that is not a picture of Frederick Ermatinger. I haven't been able to find one. I'll get to that man in a second. But he is a leading businessman in Montreal. Along with his brother, they engage heavily in the fur trade. He stays in Montreal recruiting traders and sending goods out to the West. His brother is a trader in the West, and we'll get to him in a second. Through this successful business career, he acquires land, property, and he's also one of the founders of the Bank of Montreal. The Bank of Montreal will be will have a substantial role in the history of St. Thomas. And that's who that man is there. That is one of the principal founders of the Bank of Montreal, Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates will eventually be the owner of much of what is St. Thomas. In the 1820s, Daniel Rappeljay, the founder of St. Thomas, will sell all of what is St. Thomas to some American merchants who the next day will sell it to Horatio Gates. He seemed to want to stay out of the public eye, but he and his business partners will own much of what's going on here and have a lot of connections with the business people here. Some of the connections that he has with the business people will later be the enemies of Edward Ermatinger, and it's a very complicated story, probably one left for another time. That is, as I said, a man, Horatio Gates, one of the most important men in St. Thomas history who never came to St. Thomas. He would die a few years later of cholera. As I said, the other brother is out in the West doing the fur trading, Charles Oakes Ermatinger. We'll talk about another Charles Oakes Ermatinger later who lives in St. Thomas, but this is one whose home becomes a National Historic Site. There it is up in Sault Ste. Marie. It is a museum. And as I said, recognized National Historic Site. He is one of the most successful fur traders in North America in his time. Once again, he has his ups and downs, but for a long time, he is the principal rival of John Jacob Astor, the American fur trader. Eventually, Astor and his business associates will force Ermatinger out of the United States, or what will become American territory. This severely curtails his trading. And when his brother Frederick dies, he retires back to Montreal and takes over his brother's fortune and properties. Now, there's a bit of family drama I should tell you about this. Well, we'll get to it just in a second here. Lawrence Ermatinger will have two sons, Edward Ermatinger and Francis Ermatinger. He is stationed, as I said, in the Mediterranean as a quartermaster. His first son, Edward Ermatinger, will be born on the Isle of Elba. You can see it just there. I've put it on the little dot there. An island just off the coast of Italy. It's most famous as the first prison of Napoleon. It didn't hold him for very long. Next, they would send him to an island in the South Atlantic, which would hold him much better. But Edward Ermatinger is born there 1797, and his mother is only known in the records as Italian woman. She dies when she's 23. Edward Ermatinger spent time and money trying to find out anything about his mother, and he was unsuccessful. And I haven't been any more successful than he was. The year later, his brother will be born in Lisbon. They did get around in the Mediterranean then. Francis Ermatinger. They will be educated in England, and their father will be, they said their mother dies when they're very young, and their father will be away in the military. They will see him very rarely. They will be raised in boarding schools in England. And when they come of age, he approaches his brothers, who are both very successful in Canada, to help him set up his sons in a gentlemanly trade. And they reject him. There's a bit of a family squabble, and he tells his sons never to speak to his uncles again. He sets them up as best he can in a gentlemanly trade, which will be in the Hudson Bay Company. So there is a couple of pictures of them. I do not have a younger picture of Edward. He certainly didn't look like this at this time. He's only 20 years old at this time. And in those days, they're known as Ned and Frank Ermatinger. And they're signed up for 5-year contracts as servants of the Hudson Bay Company. And this Hudson Bay Company, as you can see, there's the map of the Hudson Bay Company. It is established on military lines with masters and servants. And they were going to be servants to begin with. And they go from boarding school in England to York Factory, Manitoba. In those days, York Factory, Rupert's Land. This is the trading post on Hudson Bay, the main trading post of the Hudson Bay Company. Operates actually from the 1660s until 1958 when it shuts down. And there is the National Historic Site as it is today. They wouldn't have seen anything this modern or commodious when they first arrived there. There would have been something far more primitive, but they weren't going to get to stay there either. They were going to be sent out into the woods. And we often wonder what kids today, how they would deal with being sent from a fairly comfortable life in England out to the wilderness like this. I think they'd react very much like these two did and complain about it endlessly, because these two, in their letters to each other, were ready to quit the first moment that they could. They were, one of them was sent to the Severn country, Fort Severn, and in the wilderness, it was just snow as far as you could see. The other one, Ned, would be on the York Factory Express, which was very hazardous traveling. And they both swore to each other the first moment they could get out, they would get out. Ned would last 10 years, and we stay in the company for 10 years, and Francis would stay in for over 35. Let's talk about the York Factory Express, because it's certainly part of Edward Ermatinger, and that's who our main subject really is today. I'll talk about a couple of his descendants, but Edward will really be the main story. And there it is, the York Factory Express, sort of the Canadian version of the Pony Express, from York Factory up on Hudson Bay down to Fort Vancouver in the what is now Oregon, or actually Washington State. It's right on the river, right on the border. Is now Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon, Fort Vancouver, same city. The other Vancouver will be founded a little later, or come to importance later. And this would take 3 months to travel this. Edward Ermatinger being one of the first crews to do this travel. It would take 3 months in the fall. You would go from York Factory down to Fort Vancouver, winter in Fort Vancouver, and come back in the spring. It was known as the communication, because this was the quickest way they could communicate to this and the various posts along the way, which would then communicate to the various trading posts that were peppered all through the wilderness of Western Canada. But as they were the first to do this, there were lots of problems with it. They were just developing these boats, the York boats, which would become integral to this trip, both with sails and carrying their supplies, carrying furs, carrying whatever they could. Between Edmonton and Fort Assiniboine, they would have to travel overland, and this would require horses. And the first time they traveled there, and this is part of Edward's journals, is that they have a good deal of trouble hiring horses along the way, because for a lot of the natives they meet along the way, They're not sure who these people are. They have met very few white people. They don't really know what the Hudson Bay Company is, and they don't really want to hire all their horses to them. So eventually, the company will set up better relations and set up horse posts along the way. But those first few trips were both hazardous and adventurous. And well, there's a cover of Edward Ermatinger's York Factory Express Journal, which is a great source of information on the York Factory Express, one of the principal sources of material, still read and studied today if anybody's interested in that sort of thing. There is a picture of a York boat, which were used for many decades. They served their purpose very well. And there's a photograph of Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. It's a photograph so much later on than the years that we're dealing with. That's even though he's the younger brother, I'm going to talk about Frank Ermatinger first, because then we're going to get to St. Thomas and we'll talk about the Ermatingers in St. Thomas. Although Frank Ermatinger will eventually end up in St. Thomas, he will spend most of his life, as I said, over 35 years in the Hudson Bay, in the service of the Hudson Bay Company. Uh, once he leaves England and once he leaves York Factory, he spends almost the rest of his life in places that begin with Fort something, Fort Severn, Fort Kamloops, uh, and then Fort Vancouver eventually. And along the way, he will be a trader for the Hudson Bay Company, and pretty much everywhere along the way, he will hook up with a local native girl. And there you can see on the right-hand side the list of his native wives, and on the left-hand side, the list of his native children, because he has one children with each of the wives. The first one is simply listed as woman of Cree Nation and daughter Ermatinger, the best information anybody has. And in the records that we have, the first two of his marriages aren't listed as marriages, they're listed as alliances. And they seem to be alliances with the trader and the tribe, the second one being Cleopatra. And I am not as familiar with these customs as I would like to be. I'll have to learn more about them, but it's not that dissimilar to medieval princesses being married off, or princesses being married off for centuries for various political alliances. The one thing about this is it doesn't seem to have been permanent. They seem to have been temporary connections, and then Francis moves on. Although there is a rule eventually in the Hudson Bay Company that you can't keep hooking up with native girls, having children with them, and moving on. And this rule seems to have been made for Francis. His third connection is listed as a country marriage to Mary Three Dresses. And these are all these are usually the daughters of the chief. These usually give him some, and it seems to be a business arrangement to give him the best access to the trading of furs, and the tribe to the best access to the trade goods that he has. His fourth wife, Catherine Sinclair, he actually has a church wedding for. But as I said, Francis, when he retires from the Hudson Bay Company, he will move to St. Thomas, but Catherine won't come with him. He'll be trying to divorce her at that time. So he does seem to be a bit of a cad with the ladies. I've told you all the bad things about him. Now I'll try to find a few good things to say about Francis Ermatinger. This is Francis Ermatinger's house, and it's the second Ermatinger house that is a museum that we'll see. We saw Charles Ermatinger's house up in Sault Ste. Marie. This one is in Portland. It's been moved a couple of times, but it's just been fixed up with about $1.5 million in renovations, and it is opened as a museum again. In its original position, it was pretty much right at the end of the Oregon Trail. And many people stumbled out of the wilderness in desperate, half-alive conditions right onto Francis Ermatinger's doorstep. And there are many stories of families and traveling groups that say they owe their lives and survival to the kindness and hospitality given by Francis Ermatinger. He would provide them with goods. He was a trader, but he would sell them often their provisions at cost that he had, and had them set up. Until they were set up, he thought they would, then be good customers. There's a tale, which it's a folk tale, but it seems it has very likely to be true, that the city of Portland was named in his front room, in the front room of that White House there. Uh, there were two settlers in early Fort Vancouver that they were going to rename the town, or rename the south side of the river. One man was from Boston, Massachusetts, and one man was from Portland, Maine. And for some reason, they decided on 2 out of 3, but 2 out of 3 coin flips, and you got to name the town. And the man who was from Portland, he won the 2 out of 3, and Portland, Oregon got its name from that coin flip. All right, we're finally going to arrive in St. Thomas with Edward Ermatinger, arriving in 1830. As I said, he went into the Hudson Bay Company in 1818, stood for lasted 10 years, got out, went to visit his father in England, came back, and started to look around for a suitable place for he got a bit of money. His brother was making a bit of money, and he wanted a place to invest it. He went down to Port Stanley for a while, or took a good look at Port Stanley. Couldn't find an appropriate piece of land there, he said, or for other reasons. Came up to St. Thomas, settles here in 1830, and immediately, I think that when he was out in the wilderness, he had lots of opinions and thoughts stirring in his head. And when he got back to civilization, he was going to express those opinions. And in 1830, he begins that in St. Thomas, and he pretty much never stops. 3 years later, he will marry Axie Burnham, or Asha Burnham. She is the sister of the minister at St. Thomas Church. This will begin an association between the Ermatinger family and the St. Thomas Church, the old St. Thomas Church. They will be guardians of it. They will be patrons of it. They will be, attendees of it. They will very much neighbors of it. They will very much become part of their family, and it probably begins with this marriage. Mark Burnham, he is there's the list of the rectors of the old St. Thomas Church, and you can see he's reverend from 1829 to 1852, quite a long tenure, and he is a pillar of the local community, of the social scene. And Edward goes from a very lonely life out in the wilderness, which he said he hated, and it shows. He becomes a very social person, and with this association, he's right in the heart of the social scene of St. Thomas, which he will be until the day he dies. He will be a writer, as we saw with his journal of the York Factory Express. He will also write a collection of Voyageur songs that he collected while he was on that York Factory Express, or in the service of the Hudson Bay Company. Because every picture I'm going to show you, I've only shown you a couple of pictures of him. He always looks very stern, but nothing that I've read about him says that he was particularly stern. He was fairly opinionated, but he was a good musician, seemed to like a good joke. Most of these Voyageur songs are vaguely dirty, and the sort of things you'd expect fur traders to be singing amongst themselves in French out in the wilderness. But he's a violin player, and this seems to also play a part in his promotion in the Hudson Bay Company. That it's not bad to be a musician. The guys who are on those long York Factory Express trips of 3 months, well, the only music they're going to have is that which they bring along with them. And Edward's violin was something of accompaniment. And there's a plaque that is up in his plaque up in the St. Thomas Church, which I said he's very associated with, a marble plaque which says Edward Ermatinger, conductor of the Pioneer Choir with his violin, and it gives his dates. I believe he's also the man who raised the money to buy the first organ for the church as well, putting himself out of business. But he would also play his violin at the early dances and parties which he would host at his house. And there is his house. Oakton, 46 Stanley Street. It is, to some people, will be known as the house of Vince Barry, the former mayor Vince Barry. And there's a picture I took a few weeks ago of the lawn being ripped up. I actually haven't been back in a week or so to see what progress is being made, but there's going to be development on the lands. There's going to be things built. There's going to be some townhouses and maybe a an apartment building. I'm not actually sure the status of the apartment building, but there is right for the Historical Society. There is a marker on the corner there, which shows some of the buildings that were on that lot previously. It was actually 100 years ago, in 1924, that we put up that marker, and it marks. It says the place of the first seminary, which means the first high school in the area. In fact, there were two schools on the lawn of this building. One of them, the grade school, and one of them, the high school. The grade school building would be dragged down to the central school, which would be then replaced by Wellington Street School. And when Wellington Street School is built, this old building disappears. Not sure what happened to it. The other building, the high school, will be dragged around the corner and is still 6 St. Anne's Place, and it is a private residence. And it's in fact the third home for that building. It was up on Talbot Street, at Talbot and Stanley Street, served as a school there. They dragged it down to Walnut and Stanley, and now around the corner. So there's not really too many square up and down corners on that building anymore, but it seems to have very good bones, and I think it'll be around for a while yet. But Oakton, built around 1850, is one of the first substantial homes in St. Thomas and becomes the center of many social occasions, which, as I said, out in the wilderness, I think Edward dreamed of social occasions and he had them at his home. And here's some pictures of the inside of the home. These are from the Vince Barry era, about 1980. These pictures are from. But it was one of the elegant homes of the area and remains. So it's now divided into apartments. As soon as he got here, he got into business as well. He would go into trade. I believe on this same site or very close to it, he had a wooden building, and the first Ermatinger block is built around 1845. But even before that, he had a business going at the corner of Church Street and Talbot. Now is the parking lot of the Mansion House Tower hotel, apartment buildings. This would be torn down in 1928, this building, to make way for the first Loveday's service station. But in its day, it served as one of our first post offices, and there's a list of some people who have letters to be picked up. It would eventually become the Erie Iron Building, but between those things, it would serve as lots of different businesses on all the different floors, as I said, eventually being torn down in 1928 as the center of Talbot Street had moved significantly east. A very busy man. In 1848, he will both start a newspaper and run for political office. I'm not sure that that's a coincidence, actually, but he would start the St. Thomas Standard beginning in May 7th, 1844. And he was, by every standard, a conservative of conservative standards. In your old school days, you'll remember the fight for responsible government, which we call democracy today, which we don't really get to hear about much, is the other side, which they called reasonable government instead of responsible government. And Edward Ermatinger was firmly on the reasonable government side against the notions of democracy or what he would consider republicanism. His first real involvement in politics would be advising Thomas Talbot to give a political speech in 1832, which he gives at the King's Arms Hotel here in St. Thomas. And it was the only time that Talbot, even though everybody knew he was a conservative, really steps out of the political neutrality and sides with one side. And it's not really very popular. And I don't think overall it was a big success. And I think Ermatinger's influence was very strong in that, though, and that the voice must be stood up against these reformers and their Republican American ways. Uh, in his prospectus for the newspaper, he says what a direct connection and strong connection to the British Crown must be maintained. And in a fairly typical article, he will write about the Philadelphia riots and the consequences of republicanism, that it will lead to riots, chaos, etc., or what democracy will lead to. The if democracy is still an experiment. We'll see what it gets to. But as I said, he will run for office the same year. He will be elected as a conservative to the second parliament to the United Province of Canada, 1844. And the province, the capital then is in Montreal. That second picture I showed you there, he's not going to be serving at this time. That's 1849. And instead of uh, the reformers burning down the parliament, it was in fact the Tories that burned down the parliament in 1849, ending Montreal as a capital of Canada. The Parliament of Canada, the province of Canada lasts from 1840 to 1867, but its capital moves around a good number of times, and this is just one of the reasons that it does. Although nothing will shake uh, Ermatinger's conservative faith, and that will stay with him for the rest of his life. Instead, a very active man. He will be one of the key uh, people in founding the Bank of Elgin County in 1854, eventually closing in 1862. And it will issue banknotes in dollars. In the 1850s, we're kind of making a transition from pounds to dollars. It's a bit messy, but here is one of, and even messier than that, they're not even all the same kinds of dollars. There's Halifax dollars and New York dollars and a bunch of different kinds of dollars. Money was very complicated in the past. But here are some banknotes from the Bank of Montreal, and you can see Edward's picture there on the $2 bill, and a picture of our, at that time, brand new courthouse, and a train going through it, which was a little premature because a train wouldn't actually, I think these are issued in 1856, which is the first year a train runs through St. Thomas. Well, and besides being one of the uh, formers of the Bank of Elgin County, he will be a agent for several banks through his business and at his various business locations, principally for the Bank of Montreal. I said his uncle Frederick was one of the founders of the Bank of Montreal, and when the bank is founded, he buys shares for all of his relatives. And so when he's just a young guy, Edward Ermatinger becomes a charter bank or charter shareholder of the Bank of Montreal, and he's fairly loyal to them, apart from founding a rival bank, but fairly loyal to the Bank of Montreal, and will be an agent here for many years. Let's take a look at his family here, and he will have 7 children. 4 of them will live to adulthood. Francis dies in infancy. Lawrence dies in infancy. Maria lives to adulthood. Anne lives to adulthood. Frederick dies in infancy. Francis lives, and Charles Oakes, who will become the judge, one of our principal people we'll talk about, will live to adulthood. So let's the ones who die in infancy, I really don't have much information on them. Let's talk about ones who did live to adulthood. The first one doesn't live very long into adulthood. She will die when she's 22 years old, Maria Ermatinger. Though she has a famous grave in the St. Thomas graveyard. Folklore has built up over the years of the witch's grave. Maria Ermatinger was not Baldwin was her married name, was not a witch in any way, but her very elaborate gravestone turned black. And these posts around it and its blackness, the folklore has built up around it through the years. Far from being a witch, she was a young mother married to a minister. She was in Colborne at the time of her death. She gave birth to a daughter also named Maria. She would die 10 days later, and very tragically, the daughter would die 8 months later, and she is buried under the same gravestone. There's a close up of her. Her husband will go on to become Bishop of Huron later on. He's a minister when they're married, but later he'll become quite a famous minister. Edward Ermatinger dies in 1876. Said after a very busy life, which I've only touched on little bits of. He's as I said, he was a writer in many ways. He will write one of the first biographies, the second biography actually, of Thomas Talbot. It will be extremely favorable to Talbot, who was a friend of his. Talbot could do no wrong in his eyes. He will also be a columnist in the local papers here, and also for the Hamilton Spectator. I will have to say that he had one of the most poisoned pens I've ever read. I've read several of his columns, and I've gotten to know his style well enough that I can even tell when he's writing anonymously, because that's one of his tricks. Another aspect I didn't mention, he was reeve in 1856. He was reeve of the village of St. Thomas, which he kind of unelects the guy before him through a poison letter, anonymous letter campaign, which he puts up a slate of candidates. These are the guys who should replace the council that's there, that's corrupt, that's doing these nasty things, these rather vague charges that he has against them. But he's very persistent, and he gets that council changed, and he becomes reeve for the year, and then he leaves. And several other times in his career, you can see this same tactic come out. He leads a campaign against Judge Hughes, whom he does not like. Judge Hughes was put here when the county court is established in Elgin County, and one of the first things he does is get after the Orangemen and curtail their. They had a pretty free license to smash up and beat up anybody they wanted. One of our first newspapers, The Liberal, printed things that Thomas Talbot didn't like, and in 1833 he sent his tough guys around to smash up the presses and throw them down the hill into Kettle Creek, and there were no ramifications for that. When Judge Hughes comes in, there starts to be ramifications for this sort of behavior, and Edward Ermatinger, a firm Orangeman who doesn't really think that Catholics should even be allowed in the province, is no fan of his, and leads a campaign against him. Strangely, though, right in the middle of leading that campaign against Judge Hughes, the two of them will co-chair a hunger relief effort for the people of Lancashire in England. During the Civil War, there's starvation in Lancashire. That's a different story. But these enemies will co-chair this committee. So Edward Ermatinger was a funny fellow. He could be a right bastard, but he seemed to be friendly. He seemed to be helpful to people, and he seemed to be he was a complicated person. He's really the main subject that I have here to talk about. The one last thing I'll talk about him, though, is his gravestone, which is just off the pathway up to the front of the St. Thomas Church. It's there at a pretty tilty angle, but he was an investor in the White Bronze Monument Company, which was the Canadian subsidiary of the White Bronze Company, which made tin monuments and gravestones, sometimes called zinkers. And once you get to know them, you can spot them in graveyards, and you can go up and tap them. They're metal and hollow, and you can say they hold up very well. And I've never had any evidence to suggest this, and I've always wondered if his daughter's gravestone turning black. I don't even know what dates that occurred, but whether that led him to invest in this alternative to traditional gravestones. But Edward Ermatinger has one right there in the old St. Thomas Church. Another one of his children is Francis Ermatinger. As I said, one of Edward Ermatinger's jobs was postmaster. He took over in 1837 as, I believe, our third postmaster. And he and his son will hold that position for, over about 55 years or so, until Francis Ermatinger's death in 1892. He becomes the postmaster in 1871. Unlike his brother Charles, who is ever present in the newspapers, Francis is fairly quiet. And I'm sure there's more, and I know I'll do more research on them, but I don't have an awful lot to say about Francis. He mostly, when his name appears in the newspaper, is usually in connection with something to do with the post office, um, the new hours or the new rates or something like that, or closings for holidays. He would be mentioned, and otherwise fairly quiet. He lives in Oakton, the big house on Stanley Street. He dies fairly young, and other than that, I don't know a great deal about him. Well, this is one thing that he was involved with, is the building of the second Ermatinger block. We talked about the first one that was down, which is now at Church, down at Church and Talbot Street. This one is closer to Elgin and Talbot, and it is what would become the municipal world offices for many years. It is right beside the Grand Central Hotel and now the Grand Central Hotel Apartments. It is now a vacant lot. These buildings haven't been torn down a couple of years ago, a few years ago. In the picture on the left, you can see two buildings similar. The big one on the left, that is the Ermatinger block, and that is the same building as you see on the picture on the right in the closest part of it. The building on the right in the first picture, in the black and white picture, was bound up, put on rollers, dragged down the street, and now is 73 Metcalf Street, is a private residence to this day. Annie Ermatinger. Annie Ermatinger lived across the street from Oakton, across the street from the big house, and they called it Ann's Place. And the street that grew out of that became Ann's Place, and eventually St. Ann's Place. In St. Thomas, both Ann's Place and Ann's Place and Catherine Street became sainted later on. I'm not sure. I've looked up the dates, but I've not really seen what inspired those changes. But is now St. Ann's Place is named for Annie Ermatinger. Annie and Jemima, by the way. I told you that Jemima and Oakes enter the family. There's Jemima coming up again. And there is her white marble plaque in the old St. Thomas Church. Annie J. Ermatinger, valued member of choir and active in all good works. She sounds very lovely and she sounds very boring. But once you scratch into it, you find out something not boring at all. Annie Ermatinger, especially for the time that she lived, was one of the most traveled people I've ever read about. She traveled across the United States. She traveled through Europe. She went through South America. She was to Africa, Russia, China, Japan, India. Everywhere you could imagine, this woman went, and she seemed to do a lot of the traveling on her own, which would have been very unusual. She otherwise lived a very quiet life. I think the family wealth, was a fairly wealthy family, and that's what she used the wealth for. She otherwise lived very modestly. She contributed to the Historical Society, and her reminiscences appear in our, contributed to some of our early publications and some of our early maps, etc. But otherwise lived a very quiet life, but very traveled and was sort of the star member of the travel club where she would recount her adventures around the world. And like I said, I will try to find out more about that in the future. But every once in a while, going through the old papers, you'll find out Annie Ermatinger is just back from Japan. Annie Ermatinger was just back from some other faraway place, or writing from South Africa or something. There is C.O. Ermatinger. He's going to be another one of the main fellows we talk about. Charles Oakes Ermatinger, one of the founders of the Historical Society. And there's a picture of him, a very rare picture of him with hair. He will lose his hair quite young in life, and most of his pictures that we'll see of him as the distinguished judge that he will become will be of the less haired. But here he's got a full head of hair and even sporting some rather dashing sideburns. Charles Oakes grows up in Oakton. He, as I said, at that time, by that time, a very prominent family. He goes to law school, becomes a lawyer. His law office is at the Ermatinger block in in the family business. He will follow in many of his father's footsteps politically. He will serve in politics. He's a conservative, but he will be a very, very different person than his father. Whereas his father was very opinionated, very strident, very, very close-minded. Charles Oakes was a very open-minded, very friendly, I think a very thoughtful man. And like I said, he will be eventually become a judge, but not for a while yet. In 1877, he will build his own house beside Oakton, Belle Vista, 48 Stanley Street, and it is still standing today. Belle Vista being because of its great view over the over Spawns Flats or over Vincent Berry Park or the Kettle Creek Valley, whatever you'd like to call it. And I should say right across the street from where George Thorman lived. This is a very Elgin Historical Society part of town right here. Instead, he had a political career. He will be conservative, but he will, if you note from his political ad, he will be a liberal conservative. There in those days, we had conservatives, and liberals. The liberal conservatives sat with the conservatives, but they were a little more liberal than the conservative conservatives. You had a bit of a choice there. But you can see the British flag is up there. He will still be extremely patriotic, extremely connected to the British Empire. He will eventually attend a coronation, which I don't even remember what king it is, I'm afraid, but he will be over in England for a coronation at a point in his life. He will serve in the Ontario legislature from 1883 to 86. He will then run in a federal election, which he will lose in 1887. There is one of his a couple of his political ads. There he's showing you to put the X beside Ermatinger as opposed to Dr. Wilson. Unfortunately for him, most of the electorate decided to put their X beside Dr. Wilson. There's the next political ad up there on the far right there. Very wordy, but it is defending himself from the liars on the other side. And this campaign of 1887 will be bitterly fought with both sides screaming liar and cheater at each other. And what's amusing about that, particularly if you know the people involved, is that in a few years, the people who are screaming at him are going to become very close friends. And that's really, he's going to be removed from the political arena. And I think that has a lot to do with the mellowing of attitudes towards him. Because in 1890, he will become the junior judge of Elgin County, assisting Judge Hughes. There's what the courthouse looked like when he is appointed, and there it is being rebuilt after the big fire of 1898 to the second courthouse. Now we have the big addition on it. I call that the third courthouse. Whenever I got this up here, I might as well give the trivia of it for anybody who hasn't heard it yet. Right here, it seems that the coat of arms has been removed, and they're probably fixing it up. But it is there on the first one, so I believe it's there from the beginning. But if you're ever walking around the courthouse and you've got some good eyesight, take up a look at the backside of the unicorn. The unicorn has a butthole carved in it, whereas the lion on the other side, he has none. So I'm not sure how that decision was made, but I thought I'd give you that very obscure bit of St. Thomas trivia. The unicorn is particularly detailed on the backside. As I said, in 1890, he's made judge. This takes Charles Oakes out, or Charles Oakes Ermatinger out of the political arena, and all of those enemies that he had a couple of years almost immediately become his best buddies. And one of the chief liberals, James Coyne, and himself will co-found the Elgin Historical Society, April 30th, 1891. Our next meeting actually will be in April, and that will be our 135th birthday. We'll have some acknowledgement of it there at that time. I'll have some more announcements about that later. involved. He will be president. He will serve in all capacities of the Historical Society. But one of the big ones is as the chairman of the Centennial Committee. And this is the centennial of Talbot's arrival in this part of the world, in the beginning of the Talbot settlement in 1803. The original project plan here in Pinafore, or it will become the Pinafore Cairn, but the original plan for the Historical Society was to build a statue of Queen Victoria, who had recently passed away, on the grounds of the courthouse. And I actually have a clipping that they raised $6,000, $2,000 from the city and $4,000 from the county, from the councils, towards this project. But the minutes of the Historical Society say the project was abandoned for, quote, lack of funds and industry. So I'm not sure exactly what happened to that $6,000 or whatever ever came to fruition. But the plan was abandoned, and instead, to mark the centennial, the cairn was built at Pinafore, and there it is being built. Judge Ermatinger is the one tipping his cap there at the back as he places the secret documents and coins in the time capsule inside of the cairn. And it's been reconditioned a couple of times because I think I'm as guilty as anybody, but kids love climbing on the cairn, and I did as a child as well, and it always needs some taking care of and some restoration. Judge Ermatinger, as I said, he was a very fair-minded fellow, and all sides welcomed his being made judge. And I have to say that I agree. Looking back on his life, he was a very fair-minded fellow. He just was seems like a really great guy. And going through the papers, it becomes almost a joke to me that if any event during his lifetime needs a chairman or somebody organizing it, he'll be the guy. The phrase Judge Ermatinger in the chair is almost a cliche through the papers. He will be chairing all sorts of things, a fundraising committee, any sort of thing. He's even chairing things that you don't even seem to need a chairman for. There's a dance that I remember during wartime, and it said Judge Ermatinger in the chair. All right, you got a chairman for the dance, I guess. But here we see his the Cross of Charity or Mercy, which is sent to him by the Kingdom of Serbia. And this is an example of the tirelessness which he really was a great community guy, both for around here and anywhere in the world. His father was as well. As I said, he was very community minded and got involved in all sorts of benefits for here and for afar. But here's the Kingdom of Serbia sending him something after the First World War. Throughout the war and afterwards, Judge Ermatinger will throw himself into fundraising. And what I think is notable and really admirable about him is that that aid is distributed to all sides of the war. Enemies, former enemies, allies. He is benefiting anybody who needs that help at that time. He's going to give it to them. And like I said, it's a testament. And a faraway kingdom recognized that back in 1921 with that medal. Not sure where that is not a picture of his actual medal. I only have news reports of his receiving it, not any idea where the actual medal has gotten to. This is a little offshoot of the story, a little off but it is related, or he is related. This is Judge Hugh Richardson, and he is one of the more famous graves in the old St. Thomas graveyard, although he never lived a day in St. Thomas. He is Judge Ermatinger's father-in-law, the father of Charlotte Ermatinger. And Hugh Richardson nowadays will be most famous as the judge who tried and sentenced Louis Riel to hang. Riel and most of his associates. Those are the most newsworthy of his trials. But in his lifetime, he was just a famous jurist or a famous lawman. He traveled all across what was then the Northwest Territories. Most of Canada has been carved out of what used to be the Northwest Territories. They've become provinces like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia. And Hugh Richardson was there to set up a lot of the legal systems of all of these provinces. Just like Francis Ermatinger, he spent most of his life living in places that began with the word fort. Um, and a story I'll tell you about it because it's just a fascinating, interesting story. You'll make of it what you will. He had moved with his family. His wife wasn't well and was bedridden. His two older daughters had been married off, and Charlotte is the youngest daughter, and his older daughter Dorothy Lee is 14. And they moved to Fort Battleford, which is North Battleford, Saskatchewan now. But then it's Fort Battleford, and it's just a wooden palisade and a RCMP, a mounted police outpost. There's a few Mounties there, and they're in the middle of the wilderness. And he's setting up the courts. He's setting up the legal system. And as the story goes, or I'll tell you the original story, this is how it's originally told, and you can make out what you will from the other facts. I have my own speculations. But the house is surrounded by several of the constables from the detachment, and his daughter is kidnapped. Dorothy Lee, his 14-year-old daughter, is kidnapped and taken away by the constables, one of them who fancies her. And they're caught and brought to trial for kidnapping. And in a bit of frontier justice, Judge Richardson decides to hear his own daughter's kidnapping trial. This is highly questionable, but they hear it by jury. There's 6 of these guys on trial. They are all acquitted. They are all let off. Like I said, here, those are the facts I can give you. My speculation is that there was no kidnapping, that Dorothy Lee ran off with her boyfriend, who was one of these guys, and hanging out with him seemed a lot better than doing the cooking and cleaning at home for the judge, which was probably her position that she was in. So anyways, that was a very strange story of him trying that and then losing the trial, or them being acquitted. But otherwise, a very famous judge buried in our churchyard, not really connected with St. Thomas, but very moss-covered grave there near the other Ermatinger graves. Judge Ermatinger will pass away. There's his grave. But before I get to that, I should talk about besides his community service. He seemed like a guy who liked a good time. He seemed to like to have fun. He traveled not as extensively as his sister, but he traveled a good deal. He is also one of the founders of the Elgin Golf and Country Club. This is the golf course which would become Talbot Park, which now lays under our Walmart. There's a picture of its opening day in the old clubhouse there when the Belleville Golf Club had come to play against us for the day. He was also one of the founders of the St. Thomas Curling Club. In those days, the curling club was at the Granite Arena, just behind the Grand Central Hotel, which they used as their drinking place. And as I said, he was never shy of being there at a party, a lot of public service, but also a very popular social guy as well. There is his grave. There in the background, you can see his father, and all the way around that white bronze grave is the rest of his family is buried there. These are the big marble slabs for he and Charlotte. The judge will have an operation in December, just before Christmas in 1921. He's expected to make a full recovery, but suddenly one day he takes a terrible turn from the worse. In the morning, he gets ill. By the afternoon, he has died. It's a great shock to all of his friends. His old political rival, Coyne, was particularly troubled by it. And, the community lost St. Thomas lost one of its greatest citizens ever. I'll go to my historical reputation there and say, of the people I've studied in St. Thomas's history, it's tough to top Charles Oakes Ermatinger. Now I'm afraid I'm already pretty much an hour in, and I try to keep this to about an hour. I'll go a little bit further, and I always give short shift because I'm this long into the talk to Percy. And there's still more research to be done on Percy as well, but maybe inspired by his aunt's travel, by his aunt Annie's travels around the world, or maybe there's just something in the Ermatingers that does seem to like adventure. Percy Ermatinger was born for adventure, and he'll find it as soon as he can. As soon as he can, he signs up and joins the Northwest Mounted Police and moves up to the Yukon. He will be there to patrol the Yukon Gold Rush under Sam Steele and the adventures there of the Mounted Police. And soon after that, the Boer War breaks out. A contingent from the Northwest Mounted Police signs up to take part in the war, and he's over there right in the thick of the action as soon as he can. He is there with Sam Steele. It's actually under the command of Baden-Powell, who become Lord Baden-Powell, mostly famous as the founder of Boy Scouts and scouting, a worldwide scouting movement. But in those days, an officer in the Boer War and Percy Ermatinger's commander. Percy will return just shortly before the Boer War finishes, but he's there after a couple of years. He comes back, but then a couple of years later signs up as several of the Northwest Mounted Police, same contingency, goes back to South Africa to serve as policeman, and he does that for several more years. He will return in the around 1911, I think, 1912. I haven't found that date yet, but around then, I believe. He's here for a couple of years, not sure what he's doing, but the first war breaks out, and he signs up immediately. And he's part of the first Canadian contingency over into France, where he will be for the duration, and he will see all of the action you could dread to see in the First World War. He survives it, but I mean, he's an officer right off the bat. He is, but he is put through some very, very difficult situations. He's there at Vimy Ridge, and he's the commander of some of our local boys at Vimy. That is not a picture of Percy. That's a picture of Ellis Sifton, who will receive the Victoria Cross. Ellis Sifton from Wallacestown, who will be our Victoria Cross recipient from Elgin County, one of the 4 Victoria Crosses won that day. And it was only take him about 10 to 15 seconds to win it. For anybody who's not familiar with it, the strategy, the Vimy Ridge had, the British and the French had been trying to take it for about 18 months. The Canadians take it in an afternoon because they have a due strategy, and their strategy is to simply flood the countryside with more men than the Germans can machine gun. They've built tunnels that have almost up to the surface. They're quite famous for the carvings that they made while the guys were in those tunnels waiting to break through the last few feet of dirt, rush up the hill into the German machine gun fire. But they can't shoot us all. We're going to get up there. And when Ellis Sifton gets up to a machine gun nest, which is cutting down guys, he charges in from the side, pushes over the machine gun, and then bayonets all of the members, and 6 guys who are the 6 Germans who are in that machine gun nest are bayoneted. I'm not sure how he pulls that off. And then several seconds later is shot by a sniper rifle or bayoneted by another German. That's not, we got 2 different stories about that, but he's killed just seconds after this heroic act. Percy Ermatinger witnesses this, recommends him for the Victoria Cross. I think it's probably worth mentioning that when he was going off to the Boer War, there was a testimonial dinner for him. And in St. Thomas, they gave him some gifts and they gave him some money. And in replying to it, so there's an article in the paper talking about the dinner. He replies to the gifts and the money, and he thanks them, and he tells them that he's going to do his very best. And if he can do anything, he's going to try to win the Victoria Cross. And though Percy never wins the Victoria Cross, he does recommend somebody for it, and he is in part that way. And he will serve out the war, be discharged, and come back to St. Thomas. And I don't know a great deal about him after, I do know a bit about his life after that, but what he's like personally, he seems pretty quiet. And like I said, this is speculation as well, but after the experiences he had in the First World War, quiet wouldn't be an unusual thing to be. But uh, when he does come back, he has extensive history in law enforcement and the military, and he is made governor of the jail in the old St. Thomas jail, or the old Elgin County jail. There's a picture of the old jail walls that were torn down in the 1981. Uh, this is actually a picture that my father took, and this is from our front porch, the house that I grew up in. So I grew up right across the street from this jail when it was working. I used to deliver the newspapers to the jail and had, sometimes interaction with the prisoners. And I remember the day that the machines showed up early in the morning to tear down these walls. And former Society president and historian Don Cousins was out there standing. I remember him standing on the front scooper of the bulldozer, was there yelling at the men not to tear down these walls. But they did anyways. Don wasn't able to stop them. But there's one of the rare pictures we actually have of those walls. But Percy Ermatinger was the governor of there. He would be for much of the rest of his life. He would get married later in life to Beatrice Izzardi, who was the uh, daughter of William Izzardi, who was a former mayor of St. Thomas. She would eventually live on Drake Street, 7 Drake Street, and it's the one personal connection I have to this talk. She would live till 1978, and she would be one of my newspaper customers. So there is one person I have some personal connection to with the Ermatinger family. Most of them are long gone, and it seems that most of the family has disappeared. There are some family members, but they have moved away. And locally, we, with Percy having no children, this particular line of the family is no more. So that's where I'm going to wrap it up. Like I said, it's a story about multiple generations of this family, which touched on all sorts of aspects of our community. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But before I do, I should announce that next month is our next meeting is in April 24th, and we're going to have Bob Hammersley, used to be the the president of the Chamber of Commerce. He's going to talk about his experiences back at the old CHLO in the radio days and our old radio station, and who knows what else he'll touch upon. And as I said, it's also our 135th birthday, so we'll probably touch on something there. So if there's any questions, I'm willing to listen, but if not, like I said, there's you're willing to you're willing to sign off. This is our first experimental virtual meeting. I'm not sure how many we ever got up to in participants, but we've had bigger meetings, we've had smaller meetings. So thanks for listening.
Pete, it's Steve Peters.
Hello,
Just
Steve.
first and foremost, thanks very much. You did a great job, and they are a remarkable and very interesting family. And honestly, you've just scratched the surface. It's certainly worthy of a book. The one thing that strikes me about the Ermatingers, and you sort of make reference to it in your presentation, of that sense of adventure on a whole variety of fronts. Did you do any work on Ronald McDonald, spelled Ranald McDonald? And it's interesting because he has that Oregon connection. He comes to live with Edward sometime in the 1840s. He's sort of indentured to Edward in the business. And then he leaves here and eventually ends up as a shipwreck casualty. And I say that in quotes, as a shipwreck casualty, because from the lore you read that he intentionally shipwrecked in Japan. And he went on to become the first English-speaking teacher in Japan. Anything on Ronald McDonald?
I mean, other than what you just said, which is the sort of the common knowledge of his history, that he seems to, take a lifeboat and really abandon the ship to enter Japan. But other, the number of people that are connected to, particularly to Edward, that are adventurers of various sorts are innumerable, or the other generations before that, because they're connected to so many travelers. The fur traders are a crazy lot. I used to live out in Victoria, BC, and I lived in what was known as the second oldest house in the neighborhood. It was built in 1911. Victoria is still pretty new, but there was an old house called the Mary Todd House, which is a block away from me, and it was an old fur trading place. It was connected to the Hudson Bay Company, and when I was out there, I visited. It was only a block away, history place, and Edward Ermatinger was connected to that place as well. He was one of the visitors to that place. So nothing's particularly special, but you've given that's the whole story pretty much of that I know of Ronald McDonald. And but there are, along with that generation and the previous generations of Ermatingers in Montreal. I mean, I could go on about the Ermatingers of Montreal as well, who had become several generations of sheriffs there and really become one of the established families of Montreal. I talked about the Ermatinger House being the main house of the main museum of Sault Ste. Marie, and them being one of the founders there, also in Portland. So they do have they do get around. What's curious about both of their sense of adventure is also how long they just stayed absolutely put in that tiny little Swiss village, and then something snapped in them, and they're all over the place. They're in South Africa. They're in all over Mediterranean. They're traveling all over the place. But they do have, particularly in Montreal, Sault Ste. Marie, Portland, they are considered founding families on all of these places. Founding families don't always have just one place. I always like to mention that the Rapplejays, Rapplejay family are the founding family of St. Thomas. They're also one of the founding families of New York City. So different generations, but the Ermatingers similarly got around. They weren't quite here for the founding here, but we're here for a long time of it. But like I said, adventures, I could have gone off in all sorts of different directions, and could even talk about those various earlier generations of like all of the Montreal Ermatingers that I talk about all have their own entries in the Canadian Encyclopedia of Biography. If you want to learn more about Frederick Ermatinger, or the fur trader Charles Oak Ermatinger, or the various generations of the sheriffs, they're all there. I just didn't think that we didn't have time, and just not the place for it here. But a really substantial, and there is a book on the Ermatingers. There is a history book on them, but it mostly talks about their activities in the West, and Charles Oakes Ermatinger's fur trading escapades, and maybe a bit of Francis's, because he left a trail of Ermatingers all out there. There's all sorts of native Ermatingers because of Francis's and Charles's sort of I'll make a terrible pun, spreading their wild oaks. But I should have said that I did talk about Mary Three Dresses, one of the wives of Francis Ermatinger, and his daughter is Mary Blue-Eyed Mary. She comes out with blue eyes, having a European father, and she will live to be 103. She's among the Flathead Nation out in Montana. She will be the oldest lived of all of theirs. Another point on Francis, which I did skip, is he does move to St. Thomas for the last few years of his life, and he'll build a house, and it's out on Cannondale Nursery. If you go to Cannondale Nursery, go a bit back from the road, there's a stone house off of Sunset Drive there, and that is Francis Ermatinger's house. And I'm going to try to make contact. Maybe Steve can help make contact out there. I know them. I should make contact with them, and I think we should have maybe in a couple of years make that our Strawberry social location or something like that, or have a meeting out there to see the old place. But anything else? All right, let's wind it up. I will stop there, and I will see how this recording goes. I know that I've had the Edwards asked for Edmonds asked for that to be recorded, and we'll see if it works out that way. So thank you for showing up. We will see you. Any of you who come out and spread the word for April 24th. Bob Hammersley speaking. I think that's going to be a good meeting, and we'll see you then. Anything else, Steve?
Have a nice evening, all.
Thanks very much, Pete. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.